There are moments in life when a person becomes aware of a silent weight pressing upon the soul. It is not a physical burden, yet it can feel heavier than any stone. It follows us into quiet rooms, sits beside us in the darkness of night, and whispers when the world grows silent. This weight is guilt. Unlike fear, which often arises from an external threat, guilt is born from within. It emerges from the hidden court of conscience where we judge ourselves more severely than any other human ever could. Every human being carries guilt in one form or another. Sometimes it appears as a small shadow at the edge of memory, a fleeting discomfort when recalling a careless word or a moment of weakness. At other times it grows into something immense, a constant reminder of mistakes that cannot be undone. In these moments, guilt becomes more than an emotion. It becomes an invisible companion that walks beside us through life. What is strange about guilt is that it often arises not only from what we have done, but also from what we have failed to do. A harsh sentence spoken in anger may haunt us for years, yet so too can silence in a moment when courage was needed. The human conscience is sensitive to both action and inaction. It is as if within us there exists an inner witness who records every deviation from what we believe we ought to be. This inner witness has fascinated philosophers and psychologists for centuries. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung believed that guilt is not merely a moral reaction, but a signal from the deeper layers of the psyche. According to Jung, the human personality is divided between the conscious self we present to the world and the hidden aspects of ourselves that remain in shadow. When we violate our own inner truth, this hidden part of the psyche reacts. Guilt emerges as a form of psychological tension between who we are and who we believe we should be. In this sense, guilt is closely tied to conscience. Conscience is the voice that guides us toward moral order, but it is also the voice that condemns us when we fail. Unlike the laws of society, which judge only visible actions, conscience judges thoughts, intentions, and even fleeting impulses. A person may appear innocent in the eyes of the world while feeling deeply guilty within. The power of guilt lies precisely in this invisibility. No prison walls are necessary when the prison exists within the mind. A person can carry guilt for decades without anyone knowing the true reason behind their unease. It may appear outwardly as restlessness, anxiety, or an inexplicable sadness. Yet beneath these feelings lies an unresolved conflict between the self and its own moral image. One of the most striking explorations of this psychological tension appears in the works of the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky. In many of his stories, characters are tormented not merely by their crimes but by the unbearable awareness of their own conscience. What destroys them is not punishment from society but the relentless voice within. They discover that escaping guilt is far more difficult than escaping the law. The same insight appears in the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, who argued that guilt has deep historical roots. Nietzsche believed that guilt originated from ancient systems of punishment where debt and morality became intertwined. In early societies, a person who caused harm owed a debt that had to be repaid through suffering. Over time, this idea became internalized. Instead of external punishment alone, individuals began to punish themselves inwardly. Thus, guilt evolved into a psychological force that operates within the individual. This internalization of punishment is one of the defining features of modern consciousness. In earlier eras, people feared the judgment of gods or kings. Today, the most powerful judge often resides within the mind itself. The human being has become both the accused and the judge in the same trial. Yet, guilt is not purely destructive. Despite the suffering it causes, it also serves a profound psychological function. Without guilt, there would be little motivation for moral growth. A person who never experiences guilt might act without restraint, harming others without reflection. Guilt therefore acts as a corrective force, reminding us when our actions contradict our values. At the same time, guilt can easily become excessive. When it grows beyond its proper function, it begins to distort the personality. Instead of guiding us toward responsibility, It traps us in cycles of self-condemnation. A person may become obsessed with past mistakes, replaying them endlessly in the mind as if hoping that reflection alone could undo the past. This is one of the great paradoxes of guilt. It emerges from the desire to become better, yet it can also prevent transformation by anchoring us to what cannot be changed. The past becomes a permanent presence, a shadow that refuses to fade. Literature and mythology are filled with characters who carry this unbearable burden. From ancient tragedies to modern psychological novels, guilt appears as one of the most persistent themes of human storytelling. The reason for this universality is simple. Guilt belongs to the structure of human consciousness itself. To possess a conscience is to possess the possibility of guilt. Yet there is another dimension to guilt that is often overlooked. Sometimes the guilt we carry does not originate from our own actions at all. It may come from expectations imposed by family, society, or culture. A person may feel guilty simply for being different, for following a path that others do not approve of. In such cases, guilt becomes a social instrument, a force used to enforce conformity rather than moral truth. The philosopher Albert Camus explored this tension in his reflections on the absurd condition of human life. Camus suggested that society often demands emotional responses that conform to its expectations. When individuals fail to display these expected emotions, they may be judged harshly. In such situations, guilt is no longer tied to genuine wrongdoing, but to the violation of social norms. This raises an unsettling question. How much of the guilt we carry is truly ours, and how much has been inherited from the expectations of others? For many people, this question remains unanswered. They continue to carry burdens whose origins they barely understand. The weight of guilt becomes so familiar that it begins to feel like a natural part of existence. Yet, beneath this familiarity lies a deeper psychological drama, one that reveals how guilt shapes identity, morality, and the human search for meaning. To understand guilt fully, we must look beyond individual actions and examine the deeper forces within the psyche that give guilt its extraordinary power. Only then can we begin to see why this emotion, though painful, has accompanied humanity throughout its entire history. And perhaps more importantly, we may begin to ask whether guilt is something that must always imprison us, or whether it can become a path toward deeper self-understanding. If guilt were merely the memory of a mistake, it would fade with time. Memories weaken, events lose their emotional intensity, and the past gradually dissolves into distance. Yet guilt often behaves differently. Instead of fading, it can grow stronger as the years pass. What began as a brief moment of regret can slowly transform into a defining feature of a person's inner life. It becomes part of how they see themselves, shaping the narrative through which they interpret their own existence. To understand why guilt persists with such stubborn force, we must look deeper into the structure of the human psyche. According to the psychoanalytic tradition, the human mind is not a unified whole but a field of conflicting forces. Desires, instincts, ideals, and moral standards exist within us simultaneously, often pulling in opposite directions. When these forces collide, psychological tension arises. The Austrian psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud described guilt as the product of this inner conflict. Freud believed that human beings are born with powerful instincts that seek immediate satisfaction. At the same time, society imposes rules that restrict these impulses in order to maintain order and cooperation. The internalized voice of these social rules forms what Freud called the superego, a psychological authority that judges our thoughts and actions. The superego is both necessary and merciless. It acts as a moral compass, reminding us of the standards we strive to live by. Yet it can also become a harsh inner critic, condemning us not only for what we have done, but even for what we have imagined doing. In this way, guilt can arise from thoughts alone, even when no action has been taken. The mind punishes itself for impulses that never leave the realm of imagination. This is one of the most unsettling aspects of guilt. It reveals that morality does not operate only in the external world. The moral struggle unfolds largely within the private theater of the mind. A person may outwardly appear calm and respectable while internally wrestling with intense feelings of shame, remorse, and self-accusation. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche viewed this inward turn of morality as one of the most significant developments in human history. In his analysis, early human societies dealt with wrongdoing through visible punishment. The offender paid a debt through suffering, and the matter was considered resolved. But as civilizations evolved, punishment moved inward. The individual began to judge himself according to internalized standards. What was once external became psychological. Nietzsche argued that this transformation gave birth to what he called the bad conscience. Instead of releasing aggression outwardly, human beings turned it against themselves. The instinct for punishment, once directed toward enemies, now targeted the self. Guilt therefore became a form of self-inflicted suffering, a wound created by the mind itself. While Nietzsche saw this process as a source of psychological torment, he also recognized its role in shaping human civilization. The internalization of moral judgment allowed societies to function with greater stability. People did not need constant surveillance if they carried the judge within them. Conscience became a silent guardian of social order. Yet this internal guardian can easily become tyrannical. The mind begins to replay past mistakes with relentless precision, examining every detail as if conducting an endless trial. The accused and the judge are the same person, yet the verdict never seems final. No matter how much time passes, the case remains open. This endless trial reveals something fundamental about human consciousness. Unlike animals, human beings possess the ability to remember and reinterpret the past. Memory gives us identity, but it also allows us to revisit our failures again and again. Each recollection becomes an opportunity for renewed judgment. In literature, this psychological torment appears repeatedly. Characters burdened by guilt often find themselves trapped between the desire to forget and the compulsion to remember. They wish to escape the past, yet something within them insists on returning to it. The mind becomes both the prison and the prisoner. The novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky portrayed this torment with extraordinary depth. In many of his stories, the true punishment of the guilty character does not come from external authorities, but from the unbearable pressure of conscience. The individual becomes alienated from himself, unable to reconcile his actions with the image he once held of who he was. This alienation reveals another important dimension of guilt. When a person commits an act that contradicts their deepest values, the result is not only remorse, but also a fracture in identity. The individual begins to question the very nature of the self. Am I the person I believe myself to be? Or someone entirely different? Such questions can be profoundly destabilizing. Identity is built upon a narrative we tell ourselves about our character and intentions. Guilt disrupts this narrative by introducing evidence that contradicts it. The self-image we relied upon begins to crumble, replaced by doubt and uncertainty. In some cases, guilt may even lead to a desperate attempt at self-punishment. People who cannot forgive themselves may unconsciously sabotage their own happiness, believing that they do not deserve peace or fulfillment. Success begins to feel undeserved, joy inappropriate. The individual carries an invisible sentence imposed by his own conscience. Yet even within this darkness, there exists a possibility of transformation. The very pain of guilt can awaken a deeper awareness of one's values. When a person recognizes the distance between who they are and who they wish to be, the possibility of change emerges. In this sense, guilt can act as a catalyst for moral development. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung emphasized that confronting one's moral failures is an essential step in psychological growth. According to Jung, human beings must eventually face the darker aspects of their own nature, what he called the shadow. This shadow contains impulses and tendencies that the conscious mind prefers to deny or ignore. When guilt arises, it often signals that the shadow has become visible. Something we believed ourselves incapable of doing has been revealed as part of our potential. This realization can be deeply unsettling, yet it is also necessary for a more complete understanding of the self. To acknowledge guilt is therefore to acknowledge complexity. It is to accept that the human soul is not purely noble nor purely corrupt, but a mixture of both. The struggle between these opposing forces is what gives human life its moral depth. But this realization leads to another question that is even more difficult. If guilt reveals our moral awareness, how do we live with it without being destroyed by it? How can a person accept responsibility for the past while still allowing the possibility of renewal? These questions lead us into one of the deepest psychological mysteries surrounding guilt, the delicate boundary between responsibility and self-condemnation. Understanding this boundary may determine whether guilt becomes a force of transformation or a lifelong burden that the soul can never escape. There is a moment in the experience of guilt when the mind reaches a crossroads. On one path lies responsibility, the difficult but constructive acknowledgement of one's actions and their consequences. On the other lies self-condemnation, a darker path in which the individual becomes trapped in an endless cycle of blame and punishment. Though these two responses may appear similar on the surface, psychologically they are profoundly different. Responsibility opens the possibility of growth, while self-condemnation freezes the individual in the past. Many people fail to recognize this distinction. They believe that the intensity of their guilt proves the sincerity of their remorse. The deeper the suffering, the more they feel they are honoring the seriousness of their mistake. Yet this belief can quietly transform guilt into something destructive. Instead of learning from the past, the individual becomes imprisoned by it. The memory of the error grows into a permanent mark upon identity, something that seems impossible to erase. This transformation often occurs because guilt is closely linked to shame. Although these two emotions are related, they operate in different ways. Guilt focuses on an action. Something was done that should not have been done. Shame, however, targets the self. It whispers a far more devastating conclusion, not that one has made a mistake, but that one is fundamentally flawed. When guilt turns into shame, the entire structure of the personality can be affected. A single act becomes evidence of a deeper defect in character. The person no longer thinks, "I did something wrong," but instead begins to think, "I am something wrong." This shift can have profound consequences for how individuals relate to themselves and to others. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard explored this psychological tension in his reflections on despair. Kierkegaard argued that human beings often struggle with the gap between the person they are and the person they feel they ought to become. When this gap becomes too wide, it produces a form of despair that eats away at the individual from within. Guilt can deepen this despair when the individual becomes convinced that reconciliation with their ideal self is impossible. Yet Kierkegaard also believed that confronting despair could lead to a deeper form of self-awareness. When a person recognizes the limits of their own perfection, they may begin to approach themselves with a greater degree of honesty and humility. In this sense, the experience of guilt can shatter illusions about moral purity and reveal the fragile nature of human goodness. This fragile goodness is something that philosophers have wrestled with for centuries. The human being is capable of extraordinary compassion, creativity, and sacrifice. At the same time, history shows that the same human nature can produce cruelty, betrayal, and indifference. Guilt arises precisely because we exist at the intersection of these opposing possibilities. The philosopher Albert Camus approached this tension from another angle. Camus believed that human life unfolds in an indifferent universe, one that does not provide clear answers about morality or meaning. In such a world, individuals must create their own ethical standards. When they violate those standards, guilt emerges as a reminder of the responsibility that comes with freedom. This perspective reveals something crucial about guilt. It is inseparable from human freedom. Only beings capable of choice can experience guilt. An animal that follows instinct does not torment itself with moral reflection. Human beings, however, possess the unsettling ability to look back upon their own actions and evaluate them according to internal principles. Freedom therefore carries with it the burden of moral awareness. But freedom also opens the door to redemption. Because our actions arise from choice, they are not fixed forever in determining who we are. A single mistake does not define the entire trajectory of a life. The possibility of change remains present as long as the individual continues to act and make decisions. This idea, however, is difficult to accept for someone overwhelmed by guilt. The mind often clings to the past with a strange persistence. It replays the event repeatedly, analyzing every detail, imagining alternative outcomes that could have occurred if different choices had been made. These imagined scenarios create the painful illusion that the past might somehow be corrected through endless reflection. Yet, the past is immovable. No amount of mental rehearsal can change what has already occurred. The attempt to rewrite history within the mind becomes a source of continual frustration, reinforcing the feeling that one is trapped within a moment that can never truly be escaped. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung observed that this tendency reflects a deeper psychological need. Human beings seek wholeness within their inner world. When a past action disrupts the harmony of the psyche, the mind instinctively returns to it in an attempt to restore balance. Guilt therefore signals that something within the personality remains unresolved. Resolving this tension does not mean forgetting the past. Instead, it requires integrating the experience into a broader understanding of oneself. The mistake must become part of the individual story rather than a permanent interruption of it. This process demands courage because it involves acknowledging both one's capacity for wrongdoing and one's capacity for growth. One of the greatest obstacles in this process is the fear of self-forgiveness. Many people hesitate to forgive themselves because they worry that doing so would minimize the seriousness of their actions. They believe that holding onto guilt proves their moral integrity. Yet, this belief misunderstands the nature of responsibility. True responsibility does not require endless self-punishment. It requires honest recognition of harm, a willingness to repair what can be repaired, and a commitment to act differently in the future. Beyond this point, continued self-condemnation no longer serves a moral purpose. It becomes merely another form of suffering. This distinction is subtle but essential. When guilt guides us toward responsibility, it functions as a moral compass. When it traps us in perpetual shame, it becomes a psychological prison. Learning to recognize this difference is one of the most important challenges in the emotional life of any human being. Yet even when individuals understand this intellectually, the emotional weight of guilt can remain surprisingly persistent. The mind may accept the possibility of forgiveness, while the heart continues to carry the burden. Something deeper than rational thought holds the memory in place. To understand why guilt possesses such enduring power, we must look beyond individual psychology and examine the cultural and symbolic meanings that human societies have attached to guilt throughout history. For guilt is not only a private emotion, it is also a powerful force woven into religion, law, and collective morality. Long before psychology attempted to explain guilt as an inner conflict of the mind, human civilizations were already trying to understand its mysterious power. Across cultures and centuries, guilt has appeared not merely as an emotion but as a moral force embedded in religion, myth, and law. Ancient societies believed that wrongdoing disturbed the balance of the cosmos itself, and guilt was the invisible sign that harmony had been broken. In many early traditions, guilt was closely connected with the idea of debt. To commit a harmful act was not simply to violate a rule, but to incur a moral obligation that demanded repayment. Punishment sacrifice, or ritual purification served as ways of restoring equilibrium. Once the debt had been paid, the individual could return to society with a cleansed conscience. This ancient understanding reveals an important aspect of guilt. It always points toward restoration. The pain of guilt is not meant to exist forever. It exists to remind the individual that something must be corrected. When the correction is made, the burden should in principle be lifted. Yet modern consciousness often struggles with this final step. The individual recognizes the wrongdoing but continues to carry the weight long after any practical repair is possible. Religion has historically played a central role in addressing this problem. Many religious traditions developed rituals designed specifically to confront guilt and transform it into reconciliation. Confession, repentance, and forgiveness became essential elements in the moral life of communities. These practices acknowledged that human beings inevitably make mistakes and require a path back toward moral wholeness. At the psychological level, these rituals serve an important function. They externalize guilt, allowing the individual to express remorse openly rather than carrying it silently within the mind. When guilt remains unspoken, it tends to grow in intensity. The imagination magnifies the error, turning it into something far more monstrous than it may have been in reality. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche was deeply critical of the ways religious systems sometimes manipulated guilt as a tool of control. Nietzsche believed that institutions could exploit the human capacity for guilt in order to impose obedience and maintain authority. By convincing individuals that they were fundamentally sinful, religious structures could ensure that people remained dependent on external sources of redemption. Yet, even Nietzsche recognized that guilt could not simply be dismissed as an artificial construct. The feeling itself arises from genuine moral awareness. Human beings possess the remarkable ability to evaluate their own behavior according to ideals that may never be perfectly achieved. This aspiration toward moral perfection inevitably produces moments of failure, and from these failures guilt is born. But why does guilt sometimes become so overwhelming that it seems to consume the entire personality? One answer lies in the human tendency toward perfectionism. Many individuals hold themselves to standards so high that any deviation appears catastrophic. A small mistake becomes evidence of a larger moral collapse. Perfectionism creates an environment in which guilt thrives. The individual becomes hyper-aware of every imperfection, constantly measuring their actions against an impossible ideal. The result is a life lived under permanent internal surveillance. Every thought and action is subjected to scrutiny, and the smallest failure triggers a wave of self-reproach. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung observed that this relentless self-judgment often reflects an imbalance within the psyche. The conscious mind becomes overly identified with an idealized image of virtue, while the less acceptable aspects of the personality are pushed into the unconscious. These rejected elements form what Jung famously called the shadow. The shadow contains impulses, desires, and traits that the conscious personality refuses to acknowledge. Yet these hidden aspects do not disappear. They continue to exist beneath the surface of awareness, influencing behavior in subtle ways. When the shadow suddenly emerges in action or thought, the conscious mind reacts with shock and guilt. The individual is confronted with evidence that they are not as morally pure as they believed. This confrontation can be profoundly unsettling. It challenges the comforting illusion that human beings can be entirely good if they simply try hard enough. Jung believed that psychological maturity requires recognizing that the potential for both good and evil exists within every person. The goal is not to eliminate the shadow, but to understand and integrate it. Integration does not mean acting upon destructive impulses. Rather, it means acknowledging their existence and learning to channel their energy in constructive ways. When individuals accept the complexity of their own nature, guilt often becomes less overwhelming. The person no longer expects absolute perfection from themselves, and therefore experiences moral failure with greater balance. Literature provides powerful illustrations of this psychological process. Characters who attempt to deny their darker impulses often become consumed by guilt when those impulses inevitably surface. By contrast, those who confront their inner conflicts honestly are sometimes able to transform guilt into insight. The novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky frequently depicted this transformation in his stories. His characters endure intense moral crises, yet through suffering they gain a deeper understanding of themselves and others. Their guilt becomes the beginning of spiritual awakening, rather than the end of their moral journey. This idea suggests that guilt may serve a paradoxical role in human life. It exposes our failures, yet it also reveals our capacity for moral reflection. A creature incapable of guilt would also be incapable of conscience. The very emotion that causes such profound suffering is evidence of our ability to care about the consequences of our actions. However, the transformation of guilt into wisdom does not occur automatically. Many people remain trapped in cycles of regret for years or even decades. They replay the same memories repeatedly, unable to release the emotional charge attached to them. The past becomes a permanent presence in their psychological landscape. Breaking the cycle requires more than intellectual understanding. It requires a fundamental shift in how the individual relates to their own humanity. Instead of demanding perfection, they must accept the inevitability of imperfection. Only through this acceptance can guilt begin to loosen its grip. Yet acceptance does not mean indifference. The challenge lies in holding two truths simultaneously, acknowledging wrongdoing while also recognizing the possibility of growth. This delicate balance represents one of the most difficult psychological achievements in human life, for guilt ultimately forces us to confront a question that reaches to the core of human existence, whether a person is defined forever by their worst moment or whether the story of a life remains open to transformation. Every life contains moments that we wish had unfolded differently. A careless word spoken in anger, a betrayal of trust, a failure to act when courage was required. These events often remain etched into memory long after the circumstances have passed. Guilt ensures that they are not easily forgotten. It returns to them again and again, asking questions that have no simple answers. Why did I act this way? What kind of person does this make me? Could I have chosen differently? These questions are painful because they touch the deepest part of human identity. They reveal that our lives are not merely sequences of events, but moral narratives through which we attempt to understand who we are. Each action becomes a chapter in the story we tell about ourselves. When one chapter contains harm or failure, the entire narrative begins to feel uncertain. Yet, the human story is rarely as simple as the mind initially believes. A single act does not define the totality of a person's character. Human beings are not static creatures. They are constantly evolving through experience, reflection, and choice. The past may shape us, but it does not imprison us completely. The philosopher Albert Camus wrote about the strange tension between the human longing for meaning and the indifferent nature of the universe. In this tension, individuals are forced to confront the reality that life does not provide clear moral scripts. Each person must navigate the complexity of existence while making decisions whose consequences cannot always be foreseen. Guilt often arises precisely from this uncertainty. Human beings frequently judge their past actions with knowledge they did not possess at the time. Looking backward, the correct choice may appear obvious. Yet in the moment itself, life rarely presents such clarity. Decisions are made in the midst of emotion, confusion, and limited understanding. Recognizing this does not eliminate responsibility, but it introduces a measure of compassion into self-reflection. The person who acted in the past was not the same person who reflects upon that action today. Experience has changed them. Insight has grown. What once seemed acceptable may now appear deeply troubling. This transformation of perspective is one of the most remarkable features of human consciousness. It reveals that guilt, painful as it is, often signals the presence of moral development. The discomfort arises because our values have evolved beyond the standards that guided our earlier behavior. In this sense, guilt can be understood as the shadow cast by growth. The individual who has matured morally may look back upon earlier actions with regret, yet this regret is evidence that something within the psyche has changed. The conscience that now condemns the past did not yet exist in its present form when the action occurred. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung believed that the human psyche moves gradually toward greater wholeness through a lifelong process he called individuation. During this journey, individuals confront the hidden aspects of their own nature and integrate them into a more complete understanding of themselves. Guilt often appears during this process because it exposes the gap between the ideal self and the lived reality of one's actions. Rather than seeing guilt solely as a burden, Jung suggested that it could become a doorway into deeper self-knowledge. When individuals examine the emotions surrounding their guilt honestly, they begin to uncover the motivations, fears, and unconscious patterns that shaped their behavior. This exploration transforms guilt from a purely negative experience into an opportunity for psychological insight. Yet insight alone does not dissolve guilt entirely. What ultimately brings resolution is the recognition that human life is fundamentally imperfect. No person moves through existence without causing harm at some point, whether intentionally or unintentionally. To demand a flawless moral record from oneself is to demand something that no human being has ever achieved. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard observed that part of becoming an authentic individual involves accepting the limits of human perfection. The individual must acknowledge both the nobility and the fragility of human nature. Only then can one move beyond despair toward a more honest relationship with oneself. This honesty includes recognizing that guilt has a purpose, but also a limit. Its purpose is to awaken responsibility, to remind us that our actions matter and that they affect the lives of others. Its limit is reached when that recognition has been fully integrated. Beyond that point, guilt ceases to guide moral awareness and begins merely to prolong suffering. Learning where this boundary lies is one of the quiet tasks of maturity. It requires the courage to face the past without becoming enslaved by it. The memory of wrongdoing must remain as a lesson, but it cannot be allowed to eclipse every other aspect of one's identity. For the story of a life is always larger than its darkest moment. Within the same person who once acted wrongly exists the capacity for kindness, understanding, and change. Human identity is not defined by a single act, but by the ongoing movement of consciousness through time. This movement offers a profound possibility. Each new decision becomes a chance to reshape the narrative of one's life. The past cannot be rewritten, but the meaning attached to it can evolve. What once appeared as an unbearable weight may eventually become a source of humility and wisdom. In this transformation, guilt loses its role as an oppressor and becomes instead a quiet teacher. It reminds us of the fragile power of human choice and the responsibility that accompanies it. At the same time, it invites us to approach ourselves and others with greater empathy, recognizing that everyone carries invisible burdens within the heart. Perhaps this is the deepest lesson hidden within the experience of guilt. The weight we carry is not meant to crush the soul but to awaken it. It calls us to look honestly at who we have been and who we might still become. And in that difficult space between regret and possibility, the human being continues the lifelong search for reconciliation with the self.